December 1st, 1987, Chicago, Illinois. While speaking with his mother on the phone, 39 years old Charles Sutton shares his plans to take a trip to India. After not hearing from him for weeks, Charles' parents check his house and discover he's missing, but they find what appears to be a last will and testament where Charles names a woman named Terri Hoffman as the executor of his estate. Hoffman runs a spiritual movement called Conscious Development, a cult-like organization which Charles had joined. While several people associated with Hoffman will die under suspicious circumstances over the years, she's not charged with any of their deaths, and Charles Sutton is never found. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got an unusual missing persons case to cover today. The 1987 disappearance of Charles Sutton. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Carolina Young, the winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Carolina. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been doing for over 2 years now, and if you would like to enter, I will be providing instructions for how to do so near the end of this episode. Anyway, this story is going to stretch far beyond your typical missing persons case and delve into a topic which has not received too much coverage on this podcast: cults. It involves an English professor named Charles Sutton, who had been a member of a spiritual movement called Conscious Development of Body, Mind, and Soul before he vanished without explanation. But in the ensuing years, Conscious Development and its founder, Terri Hoffman, would find themselves immersed in scandal, as it turned out that a number of the group's members, including 2 of Hoffman's former husbands, died under suspicious circumstances. There were accusations that the movement operated like a cult, and Hoffman would use mind control to coerce her followers into taking their own lives so she could inherit their estates. Of course, there was suspicion that Conscious Development was behind Charles Sutton's disappearance, but unlike the other victims in this story, his body has never been found. So on today's episode, we're going to explore the history of this bizarre cult-like sect and their potential culpability in what happened to Charles. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearance of Charles Sutton. Our story begins in Chicago in 1987. Our central figure is 39-year-old Charles Sutton Jr., a respected professor and assistant chairman of the English department at a local junior college. Charles is single and lives alone, but always remains in contact with his father, Charles Sr., and mother, Ingeborg, who live in Cincinnati, Ohio. As the Christmas season approached, Charles told his family that he was planning to leave on a 2-week trip to India during his college's holiday break. On December the 1st, Charles spoke to his mother on the phone, who felt that something might be wrong with him. At this point, Charles was 3 days away from his trip, so Ingeborg shared her concerns with him and asked if she should come visit him before he left. But Charles assured her that everything was fine, and he simply wasn't feeling well and would still be leaving for India as planned. The phone call soon ended, but this would turn out to be the last time anyone ever heard from Charles. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Charles never attempted to contact his parents, but they just assumed he was too busy traveling through India. However, concern grew when the date of Charles's scheduled arrival time home passed by, and they still could not get a hold of him, so this finally compelled Charles Sr. and Ingeborg to travel from Cincinnati to Chicago to check on him. When they arrived at Charles's house and no one answered the door, they decided to break in, but found no sign of their son. Charles's passport was still at the house, but had no recent entry stamps in there for India, which indicated that he had not traveled there. Concern grew when the Southerns discovered a couple of bizarre clues. Charles's winter coat, which had been neatly folded inside out, and his winter dress hat were both resting on top of an African ceremonial stool. A vial was found inside a drawer containing a powerful drug, which was described as being similar to the South American poison curare. This drug was ordinarily used as an anesthetic to cause paralysis of the muscles and could only be administered via injection, but Charles's parents had no idea why he would have something like this in his house. But the most concerning clue the Southerns found were 2 notes which appeared to be in Charles's handwriting, but were barely legible. One of them appeared to be a last will and testament, in which Charles listed a woman named Terri Hoffman as executor of his estate, and included the words, quote, "I came under a bad influence, and I was trying to fight it myself." Terri Hoffman, who was 49 years old at this time, happened to be the founder of a new religious movement called the Conscious Development of Body, Mind, and Soul, aka Conscious Development. Hoffman hailed from Dallas, Texas, and had been a spirituality teacher at South Methodist University, but her teachings proved so popular with students that she decided to found her own separate movement called Conscious Development, and it would be legally incorporated in 1974. Over the course of the next decade, Conscious Development would attract hundreds of followers, and its aim was to wage war on some beings known as Black Lords. According to Hoffman, these Black Lords worked for Satan on several planes of existence and attempted to destroy people through such methods as poisoning their blood. But Hoffman told her followers that she was the reincarnation of a 16th century Roman Catholic saint named Saint Teresa of Avila, and was gifted unique abilities, such as communicating with the dead and seeing into the future. She said she was personally aided in the war against the Black Lords by God and a group known as the White Brotherhood, who consisted of 12 quote-unquote masters. Hoffman found success by selling a number of tapes and booklets about her teachings, and she also ran a jewelry business called CD Gems, where she sold jewelry to her followers, which would supposedly protect them from the Black Lords. But in spite of instilling fear about the Black Lords, Hoffman taught that death itself was not to be feared, as it was just another state of consciousness, and that one could look forward to being reborn or reincarnated in the spiritual realm. By the 1980s, Conscious Development had grown so much that Hoffman decided to expand her movement into Chicago, which is how it caught Charles Southern's eye. Charles was always interested in Eastern religions and the concept of spiritual truth, so he often took trips to faraway places such as India and Africa in order to search for it. He decided to join the Chicago branch of Conscious Development and gradually rose up in the organization to the point where he was teaching classes and leading meditation sessions. He eventually caught the eye of Terri Hoffman, who decided to invite him to her home in Dallas to participate in some special meditation sessions. They usually involve the group's most trusted followers surrounding Hoffman in order to erect a quote-unquote psychic shield around her to protect her from the Black Lords. While many former members of Conscious Development would later say that Hoffman ran the movement like a cult, and some of her practices were so disturbing that they frightened people away. For instance, Hoffman would tell her followers that the Black Lords had poisoned their blood and convinced them to perform bloodletting in order to drain the poison away. Hoffman would make her group so frightened that the Black Lords were going to destroy them that they were left in a constant state of paranoia, and some members, including Charles Southern, wound up developing mental and emotional problems over the whole thing. At one point, Charles was found wandering through the streets of Chicago after suffering an apparent breakdown. He was carrying a newspaper which had the words, "I lived for art" written on it, and he appeared to be repeatedly chanting something in a strange language. Charles's family would take him to the Michael Reese Hospital and Medical Center, fearing that he might be suicidal, and he would be kept there for examination for 5 days. Charles's mother, Ingeborg, remained at the hospital with them during his entire stay, but there would be a few occasions when he was visited by 2 members of conscious development. Whenever this happened, Ingeborg would always be asked to leave the room while they spoke with Charles. After Charles left the hospital, he continued to remain active with the Chicago branch of conscious development, but according to friends, he seemed to become disillusioned with Terri Hoffman herself. Shortly thereafter, Charles planned his trip to India before he vanished without explanation. Concern rose among Charles's family when they learned that the manner in which his winter coat and dress hat were folded on top of the ceremonial stool inside his house was considered to be a Nigerian tribal symbol of death. Even after Charles was reported missing, no trace of him could be found, and in spite of being mentioned as the executor of his estate in his bizarre note, Terri Hoffman denied any knowledge or involvement in Charles's disappearance. But by the time 1990 rolled around, Hoffman and conscious development would find themselves at the center of an investigation by the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. You see, over the course of the past several years, a number of people associated with conscious development had wound up dead under suspicious circumstances, including 2 of Terri Hoffman's former husbands. At the time Charles went missing, Hoffman was already on her 4th marriage. Terri was only 15 years old when she married her first husband and became pregnant with her first child, and the couple would go on to have 3 children in total. They divorced in 1971, and Terri would quickly get remarried to a man named Glenn Cooley, who was one of her students at South Methodist University. By 1976, their marriage would be on the rocks, as Glenn reportedly wanted nothing to do with conscious development. The couple would file for divorce, which was finalized on January the 27th, 1977. But only 5 days later, Terri and 2 of her followers went to visit Glenn at a cabin owned by his parents and discovered his body. He had died of an apparent suicide after an overdose of the drugs Valium and Librium. Terri would soon produce a last will and testament, which Glenn had supposedly left in her safe before his death, which named Terri as the sole beneficiary of his estate. She would also later tell her followers that Glenn's death was proof that the Black Lords were poisoning people's blood. Well, it wasn't long before Terri remarried, though she would divorce her 3rd husband in 1980, and soon get remarried again to a man named Don Hoffman. Don and his previous wife had originally joined Conscious Development in 1974 to help them deal with a drowning accident which took the life of their 3-year-old daughter, but their marriage would eventually end in divorce before Don hooked up with Terri. On September the 16th, 1988, Don was found dead in a hotel room in Las Colinas, Texas. His cause of death would be described as a quote-unquote mixed drug intoxication after he swallowed 7 different kinds of pills. A videotape would later be discovered in Don's home, in which he recorded himself stating that he was planning to end his life because 3 different doctors had diagnosed him as having terminal, inoperable cancer. He said his goodbyes to many different family members, including his children, though he never made any mention of his wife, Terri, and rumors circulated that he had fallen out of favor with conscious development. In spite of this, Terri was the sole beneficiary of Don's estate. The situation became even stranger when an autopsy revealed no traces of cancer in Don's system, and no one could uncover the identities of the 3 so-called doctors whom he claimed had diagnosed him with the disease. Terri would later tell Don's son that the Black Lords had used an illusion to hide evidence of his father's cancer. In addition to losing 2 of her husbands, Terri also lost her son Kenneth. In 1979, at the age of 21, Kenneth supposedly fell to his death off a building during a construction project, and Terri was the recipient of some death benefits. Over the course of a decade, a number of followers from conscious development would come to untimely ends, leading to speculation that Terri played a direct or indirect role in their deaths. Two of the victims were a woman named Sandy Cleaver and her 14-year-old daughter, Devereaux Cleaver. Sandy became such a devout follower of conscious development that she wound up divorcing her husband Chuck shortly after she joined the movement. Sandy was granted custody of their daughter, but Chuck would later say that he agreed to the arrangement because he feared Sandy would rather kill Devereaux than allow her to live with him. As Devereaux got older, she became embarrassed by her mother's involvement with the movement, leading to a contentious relationship between them, but in 1979, they tried to patch things up by taking a trip to Hawaii together. They would be accompanied by Sandy's current fiancé, who was also a member of Conscious Development. On February the 25th, Sandy and Devereaux went out on an inflatable raft into a lagoon located near the Wailupe Peninsula. According to Sandy, they were hit by a large wave, which caused the raft to topple over and Devereaux to drown. When Chuck flew to Hawaii to visit Sandy in the hospital, he said she seemed incredibly grief-stricken about their daughter's death, but the moment Terri Hoffman came to visit her in the hospital, Sandy changed her demeanor and stated, quote, "Devereaux will be happier in heaven." Shockingly, it turned out that prior to the trip, Devereaux had written out a will in which she left all of her money and possessions, including a $125,000 trust fund, to Terri, but the whole thing was invalid, since wills written by minors were not considered to be legal in Texas. Sandy had supposedly expressed her belief that her daughter was possessed by the Black Lords because Terri told her that Devereaux had, quote-unquote, demons within her. While this could not be proven, there was a genuine fear that Devereaux's drowning was just a cover story and that her own mother had actually killed her. While following her daughter's death, Sandy took out a $300,000 life insurance policy on herself and made Terri the beneficiary, and she also transferred the title of her house to Terri, meaning that Sandy essentially had to pay rent to live in her own home. On September the 8th, 1981, Sandy left on a trip to Colorado Springs, Colorado, alongside her 78-year-old housekeeper, Louise Watson, who went by the nickname Wheezy. They were planning to see some land that Terri had recently purchased in the mountains and went to visit Terri's sister. After spending the night there, Sandy and Wheezy drove away, but later that day, Sandy's vehicle would be discovered at the bottom of a 450-foot cliff. Since the crash occurred in broad daylight and there were no skid marks found at the scene, investigators could not figure out how Sandy could have done this accidentally. Well, sure enough, Sandy left everything to Terri in her will, and Terri also collected on the $300,000 life insurance policy, but surprisingly, Terri was also listed as the sole beneficiary in Wheezy's will as well, even though she was not even a member of Conscious Development. Sandy's brother contested the will, and the two sides went to trial, but after 6 days of testimony, they would ultimately decide to reach an out-of-court settlement. In 1987, a 42-year-old Conscious Development follower from Dallas named Robin Ottstott wound up dead under circumstances which were oddly similar to the death of Don Hoffman. On April the 19th, Robin Ottstott told her ex-husband that she had terminal viral hepatitis, which she believed she had contracted from a banana peel, so he set up a medical appointment for her in which she could take a blood test. 2 days later, Robin went to the appointment as scheduled before she allegedly paid a visit to Terri Hoffman, and later that night, she would be found dead in her home of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound from a .38 caliber revolver. As you might have already guessed, Robin had drawn up a will in which she left her entire estate to Terri. And much like Don Hoffman's non-existent terminal cancer, the results of Robin's blood test showed no trace of hepatitis in her system. A search of Robin's journal would describe a particularly bizarre relationship with Terri, who set her up with an invisible CIA agent named George, and Robin would actually write details about her dates and romantic encounters with her invisible boyfriend. The next suspicious death of a conscious development member would actually take place in Chicago later that year, a very short time before Charles Southern went missing. On November the 30th, 33-year-old Mary Levinson was found dead in a motel room. She had overdosed on 2 types of prescription sleeping pills, and there was a needle puncture mark on her left wrist. Only 10 days earlier, Mary had received a divorce settlement of $125,000, and she left behind an audio tape message for her family claiming that she had used the money to pay off debts and make donations to some animal welfare societies, but she never actually named them, and no one ever figured out where the money went. During her tape recording, Mary announced her intention to end her own life and stated, quote, "I am actually looking forward to it." In addition, Mary had recently used her mother's credit card to purchase $3,200 worth of jewelry, but it was never found. Mary's youngest brother had previously been the beneficiary of a life insurance policy, but only 2 weeks prior to her death, she changed the beneficiary to a former boyfriend of hers, whom she had met at one of Terri Hoffman's retreats. Mary's attorney would also produce a letter in which she wrote that she had paid him $1,000 to settle her estate, and that her family was not to be involved in the process at all. Less than 1 year later, there would be another death connected to the movement, though there was zero doubt that this one was a murder. On September the 21st, 1988, only 5 days after Don Hoffman's suicide, a 41-year-old psychologist named Jill Bounds was found bludgeoned to death on top of her bed inside her Dallas home after receiving 7 blows to the head with a blunt object. Some gold, gems, and jewelry were missing from Jill's house, though other valuables had been left behind. Now, while Jill was a former conscious development follower, she had left the group back in 1982. However, months prior to her death, she went to visit Terri Hoffman and paid $60 to her for a reading, where Terri reportedly advised Jill to end a relationship she was involved in. The most curious clue from the murder scene was that pages had been ripped out of a diary Jill had written in 1979, a time period when she still would have been affiliated with conscious development. But unlike the other suspicious deaths we've talked about, neither Terri Hoffman or anyone else from the movement profited from Jill's murder, as she had listed her sister and niece as the beneficiaries of her life insurance policy, and to this day, the crime remains unsolved. The last deaths to be associated with conscious development involved a married couple named David and Glenda Goodman, who were both known for being devout followers of the group. In November of 1989, after not being heard from for weeks, the couple's decomposing bodies were found inside their home in Dallas's Lake Highlands neighborhood. Since they each had a gun resting by their side, David and Glenda had apparently shot themselves in either a murder-suicide or a double suicide. A search of their personal journey turned up an entry in which they wrote about receiving a message from God and stated, quote, "The way is clear to get high energies. It's like this. You are about to be joined in a marriage between your phys self and your spirit. All is readiness. The date is set for October the 20th, end quote. Given the state of decomposition on their bodies when they were found, October the 20th was likely the date when the Goodmans killed themselves. It turned out that over the course of the previous 3 years, the couple had written multiple checks to Terri Hoffman, totaling close to $110,000. Well, the death of the Goodmans seemed to be the breaking point, as Terri found herself on the receiving end of 2 separate wrongful death lawsuits from David Goodman's father and Don Hoffman's 2 children. Both suits accused Terri of using hypnosis, behavior modification, mind control, and emotional manipulation to coerce the victims into suicide so she could profit from their deaths. The attorney handling the lawsuit for Don's children had performed a search of Terry's garbage and found a number of needles, syringes, cotton swabs, and empty pill bottles, along with a letter from a man in San Diego, which read, quote, "Here is your bulk order plus the samples." The Goodmans' suicide also captured the attention of the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, prompting them to open an investigation into all the suspicious deaths associated with conscious development over the past decade. The group denied any wrongdoing, and Terri's attorney would refer to the investigation as a witch hunt, maintaining that the deaths were nothing more than a series of unfortunate coincidences. For their part, the district attorney's office did acknowledge that it would be very difficult to legally prove that mind control was a contributing factor in the victims' deaths, and they ultimately lacked the evidence to file charges. In October of 1991, Terri would file for bankruptcy, claiming that the publicity surrounding the investigation had made a negative impact on her businesses. This effectively blocked the 2 civil lawsuits she was facing, but the problem is that Terri hid some of her assets from the court during bankruptcy proceedings. As a result, she would be convicted on 10 counts of bankruptcy fraud in May of 1994 and received a 16-month prison sentence, as well as a $4,000 fine and 3 years of supervised release after she completed her sentence. But Terri would successfully appeal her conviction, arguing that the state had insufficient evidence that she had knowingly and fraudulently made false declarations during the bankruptcy proceedings. The Court of Appeals agreed with her, so the case was dismissed, and Terri was released from prison after serving only a year of her sentence. By this point, Charles Southern's family had learned all about the suspicious activity surrounding conscious development, and his story would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in November of 1995. While the show sent in a request to Terri Hoffman to be interviewed during the segment, she never responded. Unfortunately, the episode failed to bring about any answers about what happened to Charles. Terri went on to get married for a 5th time, changing her name to Terri Lilia Keenely, and she also started a website and published a book about financial advice. On October the 31st, 2015, yes, on Halloween, Terri passed away at the age of 77. She was never officially charged in connection to any of the suspicious deaths, and after 3 decades, Charles Southern continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Man, the saga of Terri Hoffman and conscious development of body, mind, and soul is a major rabbit hole, and you could probably do a long-form multi-episode podcast on it if you wanted to. But I deliberately refrained from going too far down the rabbit hole because I wanted to keep the focus of this episode on Charles Southern, who is something of an anomaly in this story. I can tell you that during the early 1990s, Terri Hoffman and conscious development was a pretty big story in the Texas media, particularly in Dallas. She first started generating public attention back in December of 1982 when the Dallas-based publication, D Magazine, published an article about conscious development, and at that point, there were only a handful of suspicious deaths which took place under her watch. But the deaths just kept happening, and this became a considerably bigger story in 1990 when the Dallas County District Attorney's Office began an investigation. However, while researching all the media coverage about this, I noticed that Charles Southern's name was never mentioned anywhere, and that might be because no one had put 2 and 2 together yet and linked him to conscious development. As far as I can tell, Charles's disappearance never got any publicity at all until it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1995, by which point Hoffman had already served some time in prison for bankruptcy fraud. Even though Hoffman's bankruptcy conviction was ultimately overturned, I've seen it referred to as the quote-unquote Al Capone strategy, which is a reference to how the authorities sent Al Capone to prison for tax evasion since they couldn't get him on more serious crimes. After a years-long investigation into the suspicious deaths surrounding Hoffman and her cult, it was apparent that it would have been quite difficult to successfully prove her culpability in court, so I guess prosecuting her for bankruptcy fraud was a compromise. I think the main reason that Charles's case was not initially linked to the investigation is because, unlike the other victims, he was a missing person and never confirmed to be dead, which is the main reason his story stands out from the others. I have to confess that until they uploaded the original episode to Amazon Prime a few years ago, I had never actually seen Charles's Unsolved Mystery segment before and only read the case summary on their website. The segment only provides a very brief summary of the other suspicious deaths associated with conscious development, but it does show a brief snippet of the video that Terri's fourth husband, Don Hoffman, filmed before his suicide, and it's quite chilling to watch. The primary theory behind most of the conscious development deaths is that Terri either orchestrated the victims as murder or somehow coerced them into suicide because they had made her the beneficiary of their estate or life insurance policy. There's definitely a hint of that in Charles's case, as he left behind a hastily scrawled note naming Terri Hoffman as executor of his estate, but how is she supposed to inherit anything if it could not be proven that Charles was actually dead? If Charles really was a victim of foul play and conscious development was behind it, how come his body was never found? Well, Conscious Development was a Dallas-based organization and only expanded their operations into Chicago during the 1980s, which is how Charles became involved with them, and he eventually moved up high enough in the organization that Terri Hoffman invited him to Dallas to participate in her special meditation sessions, which technically made him part of her trusted inner circle. Hoffman claimed that she disliked traveling and always maintained that she only ever made 3 trips to Chicago in her life, which took place in 1979, 1980, and 1989. She left the day-to-day operations of her Chicago branch with her followers, and while she may not have personally been in the city at the time Charles went missing, that doesn't necessarily mean she couldn't have orchestrated his disappearance. The one thing I cannot overlook is that the suspicious suicide of Conscious Development follower Mary Levinson took place in Chicago on November the 30th, 1987, right before Charles went missing, though the exact time he disappeared is unclear. The last time Charles was confirmed to be alive was during a phone call with his mother on December the 1st, where he told her he was planning to take a trip to India in 3 days, though that obviously never happened, since Charles left his passport behind and there were no entry stamps in there. After that, it was over 2 weeks before Charles's parents traveled to his house and discovered he was not there, so if there was foul play involved, that's a large window of time for whoever was responsible to have covered their tracks. But the Unsolved Mystery segment did give off the impression that conscious development was not the only possible explanation for Charles's disappearance. Remember, he had recently spent time in the hospital after suffering a mental breakdown, which caused him to be found wandering the streets while rambling incoherently, so it's certainly plausible that something like that could have happened to him again, and Charles wound up disappearing into Chicago's homeless population with no memory of who he was. However, there are definitely enough good reasons to believe that there was something a lot more sinister about Charles's death. When Charles was hospitalized following his breakdown, he was frequently visited by 2 members of Conscious Development who asked his mother to leave the room while they conversed. This certainly supports the idea that the movement functioned like a cult, and there are numerous other examples of them doing stuff like this. For example, Mary Levinson's mother would recall an experience when she was visiting her daughter at her apartment and was asked to leave and wait in the building's lobby for over an hour while Mary had a long-distance phone call with Terri Hoffman. We have no idea what was said between Charles and the 2 followers during their conversations at the hospital, but you have to wonder if this had any relevance to his disappearance. Unfortunately, many of the details about Charles's background with conscious movement are pretty vague. With most of the other victims in this story, there is ample information available about their relationship with the group and Terri Hoffman, but here, all we have are some vague assertions from Charles's friends that following his hospital stay, he continued to remain active with conscious development, but he became disillusioned with Hoffman herself. And that would make sense, since Charles was a member of the Chicago branch while Hoffman remained in Dallas, so he probably did not have to deal with her on a day-to-day basis. Even if he did not particularly care for her, he still might have found her teachings compelling enough to remain with the group. It's possible that Charles's mental breakdown was some sort of wake-up call for him, and his trip to India may have been motivated by a need to seek out spiritual truth, which did not involve being immersed in a cult. The Unsolved Mysteries segment features an interview with a former conscious development follower named Peter Muth, who said it wasn't uncommon for members of the group to suffer complete breakdowns since Hoffman's teachings about the Black Lords created a constant culture of fear and paranoia, which made them believe that Satan's minions could destroy them at any time. So perhaps Charles decided he had simply had enough of that, which led to a major falling out with Hoffman. But if Hoffman ordered her followers to end Charles's life, how would these events have unfolded? Well, now would be a good time to take a closer look at some of the other deaths surrounding Hoffman. In addition to the loss of multiple followers, Terri had 2 of her husbands die under suspicious circumstances, and she also lost her son, Kenneth. Now, there's very little information out there about Kenneth's death other than the fact that he fell from a building during a construction job, so I'm willing to concede that his death may have been nothing more than an accident. And I'm also a bit skeptical that Hoffman was involved in the death of Jill Bounds because it took place 6 years after she left conscious development. While the other deaths surrounding the group were made to look like suicides or accidents, Jill was bludgeoned to death in what was a clear-cut home invasion murder, and there's no indication that Hoffman or her group benefited from this in any way. If it wasn't for the fact that Jill revisited Hoffman for a reading a few months before her death, I'm not sure if this case would even be connected to the other ones, and I get the impression that this crime was more personal in nature. Jill had a couple of former boyfriends and lovers who might have had a motive to kill her. One of them, a man named Bob Jones, had been a member of conscious development with her in 1979, and as you recall, pages were found ripped out of a diary Jill had written that same year. Jones also raised some eyebrows following the murder when he asked Jill's sister if he was the beneficiary of Jill's life insurance policy, but of course, she had left everything to her sister and her niece. Overall, there was never enough evidence to implicate anyone, but I do think it's possible that Jill's death was a completely unrelated murder which had nothing to do with Terri Hoffman or conscious development. However, the deaths of Don Hoffman, Glenn Cooley, Sandy and Devereaux Cleaver, Louise Watson, Robin Ottstott, Mary Levinson, and David and Glenda Goodman, I definitely think there was some sort of complicity there. Even if Terri was not directly involved in all of these deaths, I think there's a good chance she manipulated some of the victims enough to convince them to take their own lives, and in the end, she always wound up benefiting financially. I think the most disturbing story in this bunch might involve Sandy and Devereaux Cleaver, as it's obvious that Sandy had become so brainwashed by this cult that Terri might have convinced her that Devereaux was possessed by the Black Lords and essentially manipulated a woman into murdering her own teenage daughter. The death of Sandy's housekeeper, Louise Wheezy Watson, is also incredibly sad because Wheezy was never even involved with conscious movement and did not seem to like Terri Hoffman that much. By all accounts, Wheezy was a kindly old woman who was incredibly devoted to Sandy, which is why she agreed to make Terri the beneficiary of her will only months before she and Sandy wound up dead in a mysterious quote-unquote car accident. The situation is infuriating because Wheezy's estate was pretty meager and she did not have much to leave behind, but she still may have been killed for it anyway. Now, in all the other deaths I just cited, the official cause of death was considered to be suicide, and it's possible that technically this is exactly what happened. But you have to wonder how much mind control was used to make these occur. The deaths of Robin Ottstott and Don Hoffman are both particularly bizarre because both these victims claim to have contracted terminal diseases, but no trace of these diseases were found in their systems. Given that these deaths took place only 16 months apart, and Terri was the sole beneficiary of both their estates, this seems like too much of a coincidence, so you can only imagine the manipulation it must have taken for her to convince them they had a non-existent disease and that suicide was their best option. But this was the big legal quandary that the Dallas County District Attorney's Office faced. How do you conclusively prove that Terri had enough legal culpability in any of these deaths that you could prosecute her for them in a court of law? I'm sure many of you have heard of the 2014 texting suicide case where 17-year-old Michelle Carter was arrested and convicted of involuntary manslaughter because she encouraged her 18-year-old boyfriend Conrad Roy to kill himself by a carbon monoxide poisoning. It's become a very hotly debated case about the nature of criminal responsibility, but I'm not sure the legal system would have been prepared to handle something this complex back in 1990. You can almost say that Terri Hoffman is Michelle Carter times 10, but it's not like there would have been any incriminating text messages of Terri Hoffman telling her followers to kill themselves, so uncovering conclusive evidence that she was complicit in any of these deaths would have been very difficult. But at the time, one law enforcement officer referred to her as the quote-unquote most successful, unprosecuted serial killer for profit in the history of Texas. But let's get back to Charles Southern. With no body or any evidence of foul play, it would have been outright impossible to prove any culpability in his disappearance. Like I mentioned earlier, Mary Levinson's drug overdose took place in a Chicago motel a very short time before Charles went missing. I can't be certain if there's any real connection between the two cases, but Mary would have been a member of the Chicago branch of Conscious Development, so I have to wonder if she and Charles knew each other or ever crossed paths. In fact, I would be very interested to know if Charles found out about Mary's death before he disappeared. Given that he reportedly became disillusioned with Terri Hoffman, it's possible that Charles could have asked too many questions about Mary or made a big deal about the whole situation, which led the movement to decide that Charles had become too much of a liability. But this is nothing more than pure speculation on my part, as I have no idea if Charles even knew of Mary's existence at all. Anyway, when Charles's parents checked his house, they discovered Charles's winter coat and dress hat on top of a ceremonial African stool in what appeared to be a Nigerian tribal symbol of death. Given that Charles had taken trips to Africa in the past and was very interested in their culture, it's possible that he could have done this himself, but since he happened to go missing in December, it is concerning that he would have left the house without his winter coat. But the most bizarre clue was definitely the vial found in Charles's drawer containing a powerful drug. It's unclear what exactly this drug was, only that it was strong enough to cause complete paralysis of the muscles following its injection. It actually sounds a bit reminiscent of another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the murder of Shannon Moore, where her husband injected her with a powerful animal tranquilizer which paralyzed her body and allowed him to stage her death to look like an accident. But unless Charles was planning to commit murder himself, there's no logical reason why an English professor would have something like that in his house. The most obvious explanation is that Charles could have been attacked by someone who injected him with the drug in order to paralyze him and move his body, but if that's the case, why leave the drug behind in a drawer? The problem is that when Charles's family originally arrived at the house, it was locked, so they wound up breaking in. It doesn't sound like there were any signs of forced entry or a struggle, suggesting that someone either did a very thorough job of covering their tracks, or Charles left the house on his own, possibly because he was abducted and killed elsewhere. And of course, the other odd clue found at the scene were the notes in which Charles named Terri Hoffman executor of his estate. Even though the notes were barely legible, it sounds like they did appear to be in Charles's handwriting, so you have to wonder if he was forced to write them under duress. Obviously, in most of the other suspicious deaths surrounding Hoffman, the victim named her beneficiary or executor of their estate, but they actually went to the trouble of writing up a legal will rather than hastily scrawling something on a piece of paper. And then there's the fact that Charles vanished without a trace, so leaving his estate to someone would be completely pointless if there was no proof he was deceased. Back in 1987, unless conclusive evidence was produced to show they were no longer alive, a person had to be missing at least 7 years before they could be legally declared dead. Overall, I think it's very likely that conscious movement played some sort of role in Charles's disappearance, but I can't say that with 100% certainty. I wouldn't completely dismiss the possibility that he did have some sort of mental breakdown, causing him to write the bizarre note and stage the symbol of death before he wandered off somewhere and disappeared into the homeless population. Or perhaps Charles chose to take his own life, but did so in such a manner that his body was never found. 2.5 years ago, I released an episode about an Australian doomsday cult known as the Truth Fellowship, in which 4 members, including the group's leader, vanished without a trace, and one of the most prominent theories is that they traveled to some remote location for a mass suicide, which is why they have never been tracked down. If Charles chose to end his life by traveling to a remote area or jumping into a body of water somewhere, perhaps he has just not been found, or he's registered as an unidentified John Doe somewhere. Maybe this is yet another example of Hoffman in conscious development coercing or manipulating one of their followers into suicide, but it did not go as planned because they were unable to prove he was dead and cash in on his estate. Another possible explanation is that Charles was murdered by people from conscious development who were planning to make his death look like an accident or suicide, but Charles put up a major fight, or they screwed things up very badly. The perpetrators now knew that no one would believe Charles's death was anything but foul play, so they decided to cover up the whole thing by disposing of his body. If that is what occurred, then they essentially committed the perfect crime, since no one has the slightest idea what happened to Charles, and there's been no trace of him for over 30 years. I do think that if the Dallas County District Attorney's Office had been aware of Charles's disappearance during their original investigation in 1990, more progress might have been made with finding him, but unfortunately, I just don't think they put 2 and 2 together and made the connection until years later. But regardless of whether or not she played a role in having Charles killed, Terri Hoffman likely played some sort of role in the deaths of many other people. It is indisputable that she was an evil, manipulative woman, and while she may not have personally murdered any of the individuals who died under her watch, I'd say their blood is still on her hands. Anyway, now that Hoffman is deceased, there's really not much else that can be done about these other deaths, because even if the authorities somehow turned up conclusive new evidence that they were the victims of foul play, no one will ever be prosecuted for it. However, since Charles is technically still a missing person, the investigation into his case should never be closed until there are some answers about what happened to him. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearance of Charles Southern, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, another special thanks to Carolina Young for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. We've been doing this contest for over 2 years, and if you've already entered it before, you are still automatically eligible for all of our random monthly drawings, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter the contest and haven't already done so, please send me an email with the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, listing the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. Once again, send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we covered a story which was featured on the very first episode of Unsolved Mysteries, involving a woman named Pat Mielbach, if she was the biological daughter of automobile manufacturing pioneer John Francis Dodge. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Linda I, Kelly L, Pixie D, and Morgan Y. Thank you all so much for your support. And before we bring this episode to a close, I would like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, Fresh Hell.
I'm Annie from Boston, Massachusetts.
And I'm Johanna from Vienna, Austria. We are the hosts of Fresh Hell, your international podcast that covers murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history. Are you interested in the 3,569 ways your household could have killed you in the Victorian era?
Do you know how malaria and syphilis played a role in the John List family murders?
And have you ever wondered what Prince Albert's sex chair had to do with the murder of Stanford White? Okay, nothing. It had nothing to do with it. We're still telling you about it, though.
It's a pretty great sex chair. If you're looking for another show that talks about Ted Bundy, this is probably not the podcast for you. But if you're looking for two women that cover lesser-known cases from all over the world with a lot of background information.
So much background information that you will rock your local pub quiz from now on.
Then find Fresh Hell Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
We also have German cannibals.
See you soon.
Tschüss.
Also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.